Admiral Ethan Morgan had long ago stepped away from the life of war and command. It had been 5 years since his retirement from the fleet, and his name was now a whisper among those who still remembered the battles he fought. A veteran of numerous space wars, Ethan had once led humanity's most advanced warships into the heart of alien-controlled territories. Now, he lived in a quiet home on the edge of a small city, far from the chaos of the stars. The stars still held a magnetic pull on him, however. Every night he would stand on his balcony, staring out into the vast blackness, remembering the rush of space battles, the sound of his ship's engines roaring as they shot through the emptiness, and the feeling of responsibility weighing heavy on his shoulders. Those days felt like another lifetime, yet they never truly left him. One evening, as Ethan sat at his desk in the small, dimly lit study of his home, an alert flashed across the console he kept there. It was a message from the Galactic Fleet Command, a routine check-in that didn't require much attention. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. His hands moved over the console's controls, and he opened the message. "Admiral Morgan," the message began, "we have a situation in the outer reaches of Sector 47. A ship has gone dark. No distress signal, no response. We are sending a scout team to investigate, but we'd appreciate it if you could lend your expertise on this matter. It may be nothing, but your experience would be invaluable." Ethan leaned back in his chair, pondering. The Galactic Fleet Command still relied on his expertise, even though he had been out of active duty for years. They had sent others to handle the issue before. Why ask him now? It didn't take long for him to make his decision. The adventure of the past was still calling him, the pull of the unknown. He stood up, grabbed his old uniform from the closet, and put it on for the first time in years. The weight of it, the familiar fabric, felt strange against his body, but also comforting in a way. He wasn't sure why, but he knew this wasn't just a routine mission. Something about it felt important. By the time Ethan arrived at the fleet's command station, the usual bustle of activity had already died down. The place was quieter than usual, as if something had changed in the air. The officers who greeted him were polite but distant, perhaps unsure of what to make of the retired admiral who hadn't been seen in years. He had heard whispers about the changes in the fleet, how it had become less about strategy and more about politics. The young officers seemed more eager to climb the ranks than to protect the people they were meant to serve. Admiral Morgan, the station commander, a young officer named Captain Alan Hughes, greeted him with a nod. "We appreciate you coming in. The ship we've lost contact with is in the outer regions of the sector. We've tried calling, but we're getting nothing back. We thought it was just a malfunction at first, but the silence has lasted too long." Ethan nodded, his mind already working through the possible scenarios. "I'll need a ship," he said. "A small one. We can't risk sending a large fleet if this turns out to be nothing." Captain Hughes hesitated. "We only have one ship in the vicinity, Admiral. A small scout ship. It's been sitting unused for quite some time." "That's fine," Ethan replied. "That's all I need. I'll take it." The captain led him to the ship, a small, unassuming vessel that seemed to be gathering dust in the hangar. The paint had faded, and its hull showed signs of neglect, but it was still space-worthy. A quick inspection of the ship confirmed what he already knew. It had been a long time since anyone had used it for anything serious. The crew, a small group of young officers, greeted him with mixed expressions, some eager, some nervous. Ethan could see the uncertainty in their eyes. These were officers who had never known true combat, who had grown up in a peaceful time, far from the wars that had shaped his life. The galaxy had changed. The fight against the alien forces had slowed down, but it had not ended. And there were always whispers about new threats in the distance. The scout ship's engines roared to life as Ethan took the helm. The crew settled into their positions, all of them looking to him for guidance. Ethan's hands moved over the controls as if they were second nature to him, and the ship began to glide smoothly into space. As they left the atmosphere of the planet, the vastness of the galaxy stretched out before them. The stars seemed endless, each one a world of its own, each one holding a story. And in the distance, the ship that had gone silent was waiting, lost and forgotten. "Set a course for the last known location," Ethan said to the navigator. The young officer, Lieutenant Jessica Martin, typed in the coordinates, and the ship's engines shifted into warp drive. The stars around them became streaks of light, fading into the blur of hyperspace. But even as they traveled, Ethan's thoughts were far from the ship. He thought of his time in command, the battles that had shaped him, and the weight of the decisions he had made. He thought of the people he had lost, and the victories that had come at such a high cost. Ethan's mind wandered to the forgotten ship they were heading toward. What could have happened to it? A ship going dark wasn't that uncommon, but this was different. The silence was unnatural. His instincts, honed over decades of service, told him there was more to this than a simple malfunction. As the hours passed, the stars outside the ship's windows began to shift back into their familiar positions. The navigator's voice cut through the quiet hum of the ship's engines. "We're approaching the coordinates. Admiral." Ethan stood from his seat and walked toward the viewport. The emptiness of space was daunting, but it was a silence he had always respected. This silence, however, felt wrong. The ship appeared ahead of them, a dark shape against the endless black of space. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a floating hulk. But as they got closer, details began to emerge. Torn sections of hull, faint flickers of lights, and the unmistakable signs of damage. It was the kind of damage a ship sustained after a violent battle. But there was no sign of any nearby enemy fleet, no wreckage of a fight. Just a dark ship adrift, lost in the void. Ethan's heart quickened. "Prepare to board," he ordered. "We'll need to investigate in person." The young officers exchanged uncertain glances, but no one objected. They trusted him, perhaps more than they trusted their own judgment. The scout ship moved slowly toward the wreck, docking with the abandoned vessel. The crew suited up in their standard boarding gear, ready for whatever lay inside. Ethan led the way, his footsteps steady as he made his way toward the airlock. As the door hissed open, a cold gust of stale air hit them. The abandoned ship smelled of dust and forgotten time. The hallway they entered was narrow, the lights flickering dimly overhead. "Stay alert," Ethan ordered. His voice was steady, but there was a tension in it that none of the crew could miss. They moved cautiously through the ship, their boots echoing on the metal floor. The ship was eerily quiet, as if it hadn't been used in years. The walls were lined with panels and equipment, all covered in dust. Ethan's hand brushed over a terminal, and the screen flickered to life. But there was no sign of life, no crew, no answers. Then, just as they turned a corner, the silence was broken. A voice, clear and smooth, echoed through the dark corridors. "Welcome back, Admiral." The voice seemed to come from nowhere, yet everywhere. It was both familiar and alien, a voice that had not spoken in centuries. 3 centuries later, it continued. The words hung in the air, heavy with mystery. Ethan froze. The crew behind him looked around, their faces filled with confusion and fear. What was this? Who was speaking? And how did it know who he was? Admiral Ethan Morgan stood frozen, his mind racing. The voice, calm, clear, and strangely familiar, echoed through the dark, silent ship. It had called him by name, his name. But how? Who was this voice? And why was it speaking to him now after all these years? The crew members behind him were equally stunned. Lieutenant Jessica Martin, the young navigator, glanced at him with wide eyes. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Admiral, who is that? What's going on?" Ethan swallowed, trying to steady his thoughts. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and steady despite the confusion inside him. "But we're going to find out." He looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No crew, no life signs, just the strange, echoing voice. And something else, something heavier, more urgent in the air. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice reverberating through the empty halls. "Who are you? Where are you?" For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of the ship's old systems. Then the voice returned, its tone unchanged, as if it had never left. "Welcome back, Admiral," the voice said again, sending a cold shiver down his spine. "It's been 3 centuries since you've been here." The words struck Ethan like a blow. 3 centuries. He was sure he hadn't been gone for more than a few months. What was this? A prank? A malfunction in the ship's systems? He turned to the crew behind him, trying to gauge their reactions. Lieutenant Martin was looking at him, her face pale, and the rest of the crew was staring at the walls, at the floor, as if trying to find any clue about what was happening. They, too, had heard the voice. "Admiral," Martin said cautiously, "what does it mean by 3 centuries?" Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of it all. The ship around them was ancient, old beyond anything he'd ever seen. It was as if it had been abandoned for a lifetime, or even longer. But how could that be? "I don't know," he said, "but we're going to find out. Stay close." He began to move down the hallway, his footsteps echoing louder than before, his mind racing. He had to find the source of that voice, and he had to understand what had happened to this ship. The group moved carefully through the dimly lit corridors. The walls were lined with old technology, some of it still functional, some of it clearly broken. There were no signs of life, no sign of any crew members. It was as though the entire ship had been abandoned. They reached the command center, and Ethan pushed open the heavy doors. The room was vast, filled with old control panels, screens, and blinking lights. Some of the panels were cracked, while others flickered weakly, as if struggling to stay alive. Ethan walked to the central command station and stood before the main console. His fingers brushed over the buttons, and after a moment, the screen lit up. It was a messy display. Fragments of old data mixed with static and unreadable text. But something caught his eye, a small message box blinking in the corner. "Admiral," the screen read, in the same cold, mechanical voice, "systems are fully operational. Would you like to proceed with the mission?" Ethan frowned. "Mission? What mission?" he muttered to himself. He reached out, pressing a few more keys on the console, trying to bring the system to life. Slowly the screen began to clear, showing a map of the galaxy. It was old, showing systems that were long forgotten, but something else was there too, a marker blinking in red. It was in the outer rim, far beyond the known territories. The voice returned as if reading his thoughts. "The mission is complete. The war is over. But your return is required to activate the final protocol. 3 centuries of waiting are almost at an end." Ethan's heart raced. A war. He had been part of many battles, but this was something different. The words didn't make sense, and the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. What was this ship? And why had it been waiting for him? "Admiral?" Jessica's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing beside him, staring at the screen. "What is this? What are we looking at?" "I'm not sure," Ethan replied. "But this ship, it was waiting for me. For some reason, it thinks I'm still in command." The crew gathered around him, staring at the screen. One of the officers, Lieutenant Jackson, stepped forward. "But this ship, it looks like it's been here for centuries. There's no way it could still be functioning." Ethan turned to him, his mind still racing. "I don't know how, but somehow it is." He leaned closer to the console, his eyes scanning the details. The map on the screen began to zoom in, showing a location in the far reaches of space, an area that hadn't been explored in years. It was near the edge of the galaxy where the unknown began. The ship's final destination was clear. It had been heading toward a location, a place where something significant had happened. And the message was clear. The war was over, but the mission was not complete. There was something left to do, and Ethan was the one who was supposed to finish it. "This doesn't make sense," Ethan muttered, his voice almost lost in the vastness of the command room. "I've been retired for years. There's no reason for this ship to still be waiting for me." "We need answers," Lieutenant Martin said firmly, her voice steady. "Whatever this is, we need to find out." Ethan nodded. "You're right. We need to find out what happened here, and why this ship was abandoned. Let's keep moving." The crew followed him as they left the command center, the corridors of the ship growing darker with each step. They came to another door, one that looked older than the rest. Ethan reached out and pulled it open. Inside, they found a small, forgotten room, a storage area filled with old equipment and weapons. As they stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over Ethan. It was as if the room was alive, filled with memories of the past. His fingers brushed over an old console in the corner and the screen blinked to life. But this time, the voice was different, more personal, as if it knew him. "Admiral," the voice said softly, "you have finally returned." Ethan froze. It was the same voice, but it was more familiar now, as if it were speaking directly to him. His heart raced again, and he turned to the crew. "This is impossible," he whispered. "How does it know who I am?" A soft metallic click sounded behind him. A hidden compartment in the wall slid open, revealing an old, dusty data pad. Ethan stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he picked it up. It was old, its edges worn with age, but as soon as he activated it, a series of files popped up on the screen, files that looked like reports from a long-forgotten war. The first file caught his attention, Project Valiant. The words were burned into his memory, though he didn't recognize the project name. It was followed by a series of dates, reports, and mission logs. Ethan scrolled through the documents, his mind racing. The information was fragmented, but one thing was clear. The war he had fought in wasn't over. It was still waiting to be finished. The final battle hadn't been fought yet, and this ship was at the heart of it all. "Admiral," the voice spoke again, softer this time, almost soothing. "The war is not truly over. You were part of the final phase, the final solution. We need you to finish it." Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had always known that his time in the fleet would end, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just a forgotten ship or a lost mission. This was his past, calling him back. And now, with the voice of an old companion urging him forward, he knew he had no choice. Ethan stood still in the small, dusty room, his eyes fixed on the screen of the data pad. The files had been hidden for centuries, and yet, there they were, waiting for him. The ship's ancient systems hummed quietly around him, as if listening, anticipating his next move. The words Project Valiant burned in his mind, and the rest of the document seemed to promise a story long forgotten. His hands trembled as he flipped through the reports, each one more confusing than the last. "This can't be real," Ethan muttered under his breath. "I've never heard of Project Valiant." But even as he said the words, he knew deep down that it had to be. This wasn't some random mistake or malfunction. There was something about this ship, something far bigger than any ordinary mission. The more he read, the more a sense of unease grew in his chest. Project Valiant was not a routine operation. It was something designed to change the course of history, and it had been waiting for him to finish it. He paused on a report that caught his eye. The date listed was several decades before his retirement, a time when he had been deeply involved in high-level missions. But this document referred to a mission he had never been briefed on. It was titled The Last Stand, Final Phase, and it described a war with a deadly alien race known as the Zarin. The Zarin had been the most dangerous threat humanity had ever faced. They were ruthless, advanced, and had nearly wiped out entire colonies. But the fight had ended, or so Ethan thought. He had led the charge against them in the final battles, and they had been pushed back. At least, that's what history had taught. But these reports said otherwise. The war with the Zarin was far from over. In fact, it had never truly ended. The documents hinted that the Zarin had been planning something far worse, a final strike that would wipe out humanity once and for all. Project Valiant had been humanity's answer, a last-ditch effort to build a weapon so powerful that it would guarantee victory. But there had been a problem. The weapon, this ship, had been lost before it could be used. The ship Ethan stood in now had been the heart of Project Valiant. It was the weapon, the last hope of humanity. But for 3 centuries, it had been abandoned, forgotten, and left to drift in the emptiness of space. A soft, mechanical voice broke his thoughts. "Admiral, the time has come. The final phase is ready to begin." Ethan glanced around, his mind racing. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it carried a weight of authority. It was as if the ship itself had been waiting for him to make a decision. "I need more information," Ethan said, his voice firm. He turned to the crew standing behind him, their faces filled with a mix of confusion and concern. "We all need to know what's going on here. I don't care how old this ship is. I'm not leaving until I understand what Project Valiant is." Lieutenant Martin, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Admiral, we're all in this together. If there's something we need to know, we'll figure it out." "But this is bigger than any of us." Ethan nodded. He knew they were right. This wasn't just about him. This was about humanity's future. The voice continued, as if sensing his decision. "Very well, Admiral. Please proceed to the main reactor room. The final phase is within reach. The Zarin are ready to return." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The Zarin are ready to return. The thought sent a chill through him. How could they be coming back? He had fought them off. He had seen their fleets retreat. The idea of facing them again felt like a nightmare come to life. He turned to the crew. "Get to the reactor room. We need to understand what this ship is capable of before we do anything." The crew moved quickly, following Ethan as he led the way. The halls of the ship were even more silent now. The quiet eerily heavy as they made their way deeper into the vessel. The walls, once filled with advanced technology, now felt like tombstones. The ship was old, ancient even, but it was still alive in a way that made Ethan uneasy. The hum of the systems beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a strange energy. They finally reached the main reactor room, a massive chamber filled with glowing panels and machines. The air was thick with the scent of old metal and forgotten power. Ethan walked to the center of the room where a massive core stood, its surface glowing faintly. "This is where it all began," he whispered. He had no idea how he knew that, but the feeling in his gut told him it was true. The core was the heart of the ship, and it was the weapon that could save or destroy everything. As Ethan stepped closer, a voice spoke again, this time from a different direction. "Admiral Morgan," the voice said softly, "you have returned to finish what was started." He turned, looking toward a panel on the far wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying a map of the galaxy. But it wasn't just a simple map, it was a live feed, showing the movements of ships, fleets, and strange signals coming from the outer regions. The Zarin were already on the move. Their fleets were gathering, preparing for something big. 300 years, the voice continued, and now the final battle approaches. You, Admiral Morgan, are the key. Only you can activate the weapon. Ethan stared at the screen. His mind was racing. Activate the weapon? What weapon? The voice continued, explaining that the core was not just a power source. It was a weapon capable of wiping out entire fleets, of changing the very fabric of space itself. The Zarin had been aware of its power and had planned to destroy it before it could be used. But they had failed. The ship had been hidden, lost to time, until now. The task before Ethan was clear. He had to reactivate the core and use it to defeat the Zarin once and for all. The crew stood behind him, watching with wide eyes. They were all in shock, but Ethan could see the determination in their faces. They understood now. This was no longer a simple mission. This was a fight for the survival of humanity. "Admiral," Lieutenant Martin said, her voice steady, "what do we do now?" Ethan took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. There was no going back now. The Zarin were coming, and this ship, this weapon, was their only hope. "Activate the core," he said, his voice firm. "We don't have much time." The crew moved into action. One by one, they began to power up the systems, connecting the ship's old control panels to the core. The room hummed louder, the energy building as the core came to life. Ethan could feel the power coursing through the ship, the pulse of something ancient and unstoppable. The ship was alive again. "Admiral," the voice said, almost reverently, "the weapon is ready." Ethan turned to face the crew. They were all watching him, waiting for his command. The time had come. The war wasn't over. The final battle had just begun. He knew there was no turning back. The hum of the ship's core filled the air, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to resonate deep in Ethan's chest. The energy of the ship had shifted, almost as if it had awakened from a long-forgotten slumber. The glowing lights in the walls flickered brighter, and the screens around the room blinked to life. The ship was alive again. The weapon was ready, and so was Ethan. He stood in the center of the reactor room, staring at the control panel as the ship's systems powered up. His heart beat faster, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about saving humanity. It was about finishing something that had been left unfinished for centuries. The war that had never truly ended was back, and Ethan was the only one who could stop it. "Admiral?" Lieutenant Martin's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing by one of the consoles, her fingers flying over the keys. "We've got a live feed from the Outer Rim. The Zarin fleets are assembling. They're getting ready to move." Ethan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the screen. The Zarin had always been dangerous, but now their return felt like a nightmare coming to life. The weapon was ready, but was it enough? Could one ship, one weapon, truly stop the Zarin? "We need to make a plan," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to throw us into battle without knowing everything we can. We need to understand the Zarin fleet, their numbers, their strategy." Jessica nodded. "I'm on it, Admiral. I'll run a scan of their ships and gather whatever intelligence we can. But it looks like they're not just attacking. They're preparing for something. There's a large fleet gathering at the edge of the galaxy." Ethan turned toward the crew, his eyes meeting each of theirs. "This is it. We've got one shot. We need to make it count." As the crew moved into action, Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. The Zarin weren't just preparing for a battle, they were preparing for something worse. The files he had found on the ship hinted at a larger plan, something more dangerous than just a simple war. The Zarin had always been ruthless, but this felt like they were planning to end humanity once and for all. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the ship had been waiting for him for more than just the final phase of the mission. It had been waiting for him to stop the Zarin from completing whatever twisted plan they had in mind, and he had no choice but to step up. Jessica turned back to the console, her face lit up by the glow of the screens. "Admiral, I've found something," she said, her voice tense. "There's a signal coming from the Zarin fleet. It's encrypted, but it's definitely a transmission. Whatever they're planning, they're keeping it secret." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Can you decrypt it? Jessica's fingers flew over the keys, the soft clicks of the keys the only sound in the room. I'm trying. It's a complex encryption, but I think I can break it. Ethan stepped closer, watching as the young officer worked quickly. The room felt tense, as if the very air was thick with the weight of the moment. He knew that time was running out. The Zarin were getting closer. They were almost ready to strike. They needed to know what they were up against. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jessica let out a relieved sigh. "Got it," she said, her eyes bright. "I've decrypted the transmission. It's a blueprint." "A blueprint?" Ethan repeated. "For what?" Jessica turned the screen toward him, showing a series of strange, complex diagrams. The images were unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. They were of a massive, monstrous structure, with designs that seemed to defy physics and logic. But there was no mistaking it. The Zarin were building something. And it wasn't just a weapon. It was something much bigger. Something that could change the balance of the entire galaxy. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with suspicion. "It's some kind of machine," Jessica said, her voice full of disbelief. "It looks like they're trying to harness the energy of a star. This thing, it could destroy entire solar systems. They're planning to use it to wipe out entire sectors of the galaxy." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "A star killer?" he whispered. "Exactly," Jessica replied. "If they finish it, there's no stopping them. It will be the end for everyone in its path." Ethan stood motionless for a moment, his mind racing. The Zarin had always been ruthless, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. They weren't just attacking. They were planning to wipe out entire systems, entire civilizations. And the worst part? They were so close to finishing it. "We have to stop them," Ethan said, his voice hard. "We can't let them finish this weapon. If we do, it's over for everyone." The crew nodded in agreement. The urgency of the situation was clear to all of them now. They had no choice but to act quickly, to stop the Zarin from completing their deadly machine. The ship, this ancient weapon, was their only hope. Ethan turned toward the reactor core, his eyes narrowing. The ship was powerful, yes. But was it powerful enough to take on a star killer? The Zarin's weapon was still under construction, but if they got it operational, nothing in the galaxy would stand a chance. "Admiral," Jessica said, breaking his thoughts, "we've got another problem. The Zarin fleet is preparing to move out. If we don't act fast, we'll be caught in their crossfire." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then we'll have to move faster. Prepare the ship for battle. We're going to stop them before they finish that weapon." The crew scrambled into action, each person moving quickly and with purpose. There was no time to waste. The Zarin were almost ready to unleash their destruction, and Ethan had no intention of letting them. The ship's systems roared to life as they prepared to leave the station and engage the Zarin. Ethan stood at the command station, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. The ship hummed beneath him, its systems clicking and whirring as it came online. He could feel the power of the weapon coursing through the ship. This was it, the final phase. There would be no turning back after this. They were going to face the Zarin head-on, and they were going to win. The ship broke free from the station, its engines roaring to life as they shot into the cold expanse of space. The stars outside the viewport blurred as the ship accelerated, heading straight for the Zarin fleet. As they neared the Zarin's position, the tension in the air grew thicker. Every crew member was on edge, their nerves stretched tight. Ethan felt it too. He knew that this was their only chance. If they failed, the galaxy would be lost. "Admiral," Jessica called from her station, "the Zarin fleet is directly ahead. They're preparing to fire." Ethan's hand tightened around the controls. "All weapons, prepare to fire on my mark." The ship shuddered as the weapons systems powered up. Ethan took a deep breath. This was it. The final battle. The fate of the galaxy rested in their hands. "Fire!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. The ship's weapons roared to life, unleashing a barrage of energy that lit up the dark expanse of space. The Zarin fleet fired back, their massive ships lighting up with deadly power. The two forces collided in a fiery explosion of energy, the sound of their weapons tearing through the void of space. But Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. They had to stop the Star Killer. They had to stop the Zarin before it was too late. Ethan's hands gripped the controls as the ship trembled under the assault of the Zarin fleet. The entire crew was tense, their faces a mix of determination and fear. The ship's weapons had unleashed a powerful barrage, but the Zarin were far from defeated. Their massive ships had returned fire with deadly force, the energy blasts shaking the very foundation of the human ship. "Admiral, they're launching interceptors!" Lieutenant Martin shouted from her station. "We need to take them down before they get too close." Ethan's eyes darted to the screens. The Zarin fleet was immense, their ships lined up in a formation that made it hard to find a clear path. Interceptors, small but fast fighters, were breaking off from the larger vessels, closing in on them. "Get the point defense turrets online," Ethan ordered. "We need to clear those interceptors before they can reach us." The crew scrambled, their hands moving over consoles as the ship's defense systems powered up. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. This battle was only the beginning. The Zarin weren't just trying to destroy them. They were trying to complete their Star Killer weapon. If they didn't stop it now, it would be the end for everyone. The ship's weapons roared again as the point defense turrets opened fire, targeting the fast-moving interceptors. Explosions lit up the space around them as each interceptor was destroyed. But there were too many. The Zarin had more ships, more weapons, and more resources. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the viewport as the battle raged outside. The stars streaked past as the ship dodged incoming fire and continued to move toward the Zarin fleet. But in the back of his mind, something nagged at him. The battle wasn't what worried him. It was the weapon, the Star Killer, that they still had to stop. It had to be destroyed before it was completed. "Admiral," Jessica's voice broke into his thoughts. "We've located the Star Killer. It's on the largest Zarin ship in their fleet. We can see it on the sensors. But we'll need to get closer to disable it. We can't reach it with long-range weapons." Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. Getting close to the Star Killer would mean flying straight into the heart of the Zarin fleet. It would be a suicide mission. "I understand," Ethan said, his voice cold with resolve. He turned to the crew. "Prepare for close combat. We're going in." The crew exchanged nervous glances, but no one hesitated. They had come too far to back down now. They all understood the stakes. They had no choice but to try. Ethan adjusted the ship's course, sending them straight toward the massive Zarin flagship. It was an enormous vessel, easily 5 times the size of their own ship, covered in dark alien armor. The closer they got, the more dangerous it became. The Zarin were focused on them now. Their weapons were locked onto the human ship, and the enemy fighters were swarming around them, eager to destroy anything in their path. The ship rocked as a blast from the Zarin flagship hit them squarely in the side. Sparks flew from one of the control panels, and a warning light flashed on the console. "Admiral, we've lost shields!" Lieutenant Jackson shouted from his post. "Hull integrity is holding, but not for long. We need to get closer to disable that weapon." Ethan's mind raced. They were on the verge of being torn apart. But there was no turning back now. "Hold on!" he shouted. "Get us as close as you can, Jessica. We need to get on top of them." The ship's engines roared as they pushed forward. The enemy fire was relentless. Another blast rocked the ship, throwing the crew from their seats, but they stayed focused. Ethan's knuckles turned white on the controls. He could see the Star Killer now, an enormous cannon, glowing with the power to destroy entire stars. It was almost ready. "Prepare for boarding," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We need to board that ship and destroy the weapon from the inside." The crew quickly suited up, grabbing their weapons and preparing for the most dangerous part of the mission. Ethan didn't know what they would face once they boarded the enemy ship, but they had no choice. They had to destroy the Star Killer or die trying. The human ship shuddered as they closed in on the Zarin flagship, getting as close as possible without being completely destroyed. Ethan knew they had only a few moments before the enemy ship would fire again. He watched as the crew worked in sync, each person doing their part. The ship's hull groaned under the strain, but it held. "Boarding pods ready," Lieutenant Martin said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "We're ready to launch." Ethan nodded. "Launch them now." The doors to the docking bay opened, and the crew quickly moved into the boarding pods. They had only one shot at this. The pods were small, fast, and designed for rapid entry, but they would have to get past the Zarin defenses first. "Good luck, everyone," Ethan said, looking at each member of the crew. They were all prepared to face whatever awaited them on the Zarin flagship. And whatever happened, they knew this was their only chance to stop the Star Killer. The pods launched, hurtling toward the enemy ship at high speed. The sky outside the viewport was filled with explosions, the dark expanse of space lighting up with each blast from both sides. Ethan held his breath as the pods zipped through the chaos, closing in on their target. Suddenly, the ship jolted again, a sharp pain in Ethan's chest as another blast hit them. The pod rocketed forward, and Ethan braced for impact. The Zarin flagship was just ahead now, its hull looming large in front of them. They had made it. The pod slammed into the side of the flagship with a deafening crash. The crew inside immediately leapt into action, rushing to the doors and securing their weapons. The air was thick with tension as they prepared to breach the enemy ship. "Stay sharp," Ethan whispered. He led the charge, his heart pounding as they moved through the dark halls of the Zarin flagship. The corridors were unfamiliar, alien. The walls were slick with an unknown substance, and the floor was uneven beneath their feet. The Zarin were everywhere, and they weren't going to let them just walk in. The first shots rang out, and chaos erupted in the tight hallways. The crew fought hard, each soldier using every ounce of training to push forward. They finally reached the heart of the ship, the massive chamber where the Star Killer was being activated. It was a room like nothing they had ever seen before, full of alien technology, all interconnected to the core of the weapon. The weapon was enormous, a shining mass of alien metal and energy, ready to unleash destruction. Ethan's heart raced as he charged forward, firing at the Zarin soldiers who stood guard. They had to disable the weapon. There was no time to waste. "Over here!" Jessica shouted, pointing to a console at the far side of the room. Ethan rushed toward it, his team close behind. The console was alien, but Jessica quickly worked to interface with it, her fingers flying over the strange symbols on the screen. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. "I can shut it down, but I need a few more seconds." Seconds. That was all they had. Ethan turned to face the door, knowing that the Zarin would be coming for them soon. They couldn't afford to be caught. The room was filled with enemy soldiers, and they were ready to fight to the death. Jessica continued to work furiously at the console. Ethan watched as her fingers moved faster. The crew held the line, fighting off wave after wave of Zarin soldiers. The minutes felt like hours. Then Jessica's voice rang out. "It's done! The weapon is offline!" The room erupted with cheers, but Ethan knew the battle wasn't over. The Zarin would never let them go so easily, but for now, they had won. The weapon was disabled and the galaxy had been saved, thanks to their sacrifice. Ethan looked at his crew, exhausted but triumphant. They had done it. Against all odds, they had stopped the Zarin and saved humanity from certain destruction. But as the Zarin flagship began to break apart around them, Ethan knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. The future of the galaxy was uncertain, but one thing was clear: humanity would never stop fighting.